بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد, we continue reading in Umdat al-Ahkam by Al-Hafiz Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi rahimahullah ta'ala, reading from Kitab As-Salah, the book of As-Salah, and we begin reading this evening seeking Allah's aid and His assistance alone, subhanahu wa ta'ala, from a new chapter. Reading the chapter the author he has mentioned, Babu Istiqbali Al-Qiblah. Babu Istiqbali Al-Qiblah. The chapter with regards to facing the Qiblah. Facing the Qiblah. So we see that facing the Qiblah, this is a shart min shurut al-salah. This is a condition from the conditions of the prayer. A condition from the conditions of the prayer. So the author now, he is mentioning this issue, the issue of the obligation of facing the Qiblah during the prayer. And he has mentioned some conditions previously, likewise, and we have studied them in this work. And the first chapter of this book is the clarification of one of the greatest conditions of as-salah, and that is at-tahara. وَالطَّهَارَ مِفْتَاحُ الصَّلَاةِ, and that purification is the key to the prayer, and one of the greatest conditions of the prayer, and it must precede the prayer, and that's why the author, he has mentioned it before the chapter of as-salah. And likewise, we have seen as well another condition that the author, he has mentioned the clarification of, and that is the condition of dukhul al-waqt, and we have studied that in this chapter in the book of as-salah, in the chapter of al-mawaqit, the chapter with regards to the clarification of the times of the prayer. So therefore, the salah, it has conditions, and from them at-tahara, and likewise dukhul al-waqt, and also from them istiqbal al-qibla. And this is the issue that the author, he is referring to in this chapter, rahimahullahu ta'ala. But before we begin studying the narrations that the author, he has mentioned, rahimahullah ta'ala, we discuss some of the benefits that the people of knowledge, they mention with regards to ash-shurut. With regards to ash-shurut. Ash-shurut is the plural of ash-shart. And the people of knowledge, they mention that ash-shart huwa ma la yatimmu shay'u illa bihi wa la yakunu dakhilan fi haqiqatihi. That a shart, or a condition, and the plural of course is conditions, shurut, that a condition is something that the thing that it is set for will not be complete without it. It will not be complete without it. Yani there is the shart and there is the mashrut, the thing that it is set for, the thing that has a condition for it. So therefore, that thing that has a condition for it, it will not be correct except with the presence of that condition. And likewise, the condition is not from the reality of that thing. So I repeat again, الشرط هو ما لا يتم شيء إلا به ولا يكون داخلا في حقيقته. That a condition is something that must be present for the thing that it is set for to be correct. And likewise, it is not from the reality of that thing. Also, it is not from the reality of that thing. So, likewise, the people of knowledge, they mentioned ash-shurut anwa', that the conditions are different types. The conditions are different types. هناك الشروط الوجوب. There are conditions for the obligation of an action or the obligation of something. وَالشُّرُوطُ الصِّحَّةِ, and there are conditions for the correctness of something, and the authenticity of it, and that it's correct. And likewise, شُرُوطُ الْإِجْزَاءِ, and there are conditions for al-ijza. Al-ijza means that the obligation will be removed. So there are conditions for each of these affairs. And these issues have been clarified by the people of knowledge with great detail. وَلِلَّهِ الْحَمْدِ. So therefore, if the conditions of wujub or obligation are not present, then the action is not obligatory. And if the conditions of correctness are not present, then the action is not correct. And if the conditions of fulfilling the requirement of removing the obligation, then likewise the obligation will not be removed, and if those conditions are not present as well. And this will be clear, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, in an example. For example, if an individual were to take his child on Hajj, take a child who is under the age of puberty, to take him on Hajj with him, and to make the intention for Hajj with him, and to bring him along with him to perform all of the rites of the Hajj. That the Hajj, if it is performed properly, then the Hajj of that child is correct, although the conditions of the obligation are not there, meaning it's not obligatory for that child to make Hajj. It's not obligatory for that child to make Hajj. So shurut al-wujub, they're not present with regards to that child. Although if he performed it properly, then and all of the conditions of sihha were present, then it would be considered correct. And the parent will have a reward for that, and so will the child, or the guardian, and so will the child. As for the shurut of al-ijza, then they are not present here with regards to this child, because from the shurut for al-ijza, and for the obligation of the hajj to be removed, is that a person be baligh, and he be of the age of puberty. So therefore, the child, his hajj will be correct, although it's not obligatory upon him. But as for the obligation of performing that pillar one time in a life, then this will not be fulfilled until he reaches the age of puberty. So therefore, this is just a brief clarification of some of the different types of conditions. And again, we have conditions that that are set for the obligation of something. And there are conditions that are set for the correctness of something, and then there are also other conditions that are set for that thing to be fulfilled and the obligation to be removed. So with regards to the child who makes Hajj, if he made it Hajj properly, the child who is under the age of puberty, even though it's not obligatory upon him, those conditions are not present, but the conditions of sihha are present, then the Hajj will be correct. As for the obligation of performing that Hajj once in a lifetime, then it is not removed from him. And whenever he reaches the age of puberty, now he will still have to perform the Hajj, which is the pillar of al-Islam, which is obligatory upon every Muslim once in a lifetime. Because from the conditions of al-ijza, shurut al-ijza for the Hajj, is that the person be of the age of puberty. Although if he was not from the age of puberty, the Hajj will be accepted, and there are evidences that clarify this in the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So here we are discussing the issue of shurut as-salah. So which one of these aspects are we referring to? Shurut al-wujub, shurut al-sihha, or shurut al-ijza? We're discussing here now shurut al-sihha. What these issues here, al-tahara, and likewise dukhul al-waqt, and likewise here istiqbal al-qiblah, these are all from shurut al-sihha, from the conditions for the correctness of the prayer. Meaning that if they are not present, then the prayer is not correct. Something that will also help to understand this issue, the issue of conditions, and acts of worship, and the likes, is that the condition الشرط يتقدم المشروط. الشرط هو الذي يتقدم المشروط ويستمر إلى نهايته. That the condition, it comes before the thing that the condition is set for, and it must continue until the end of that thing. For example, شروط الصلاة. شروط الصلاة هي الأمور التي تتقدمها نعم وتستمر إلى نهايتها. That the conditions, these are requirements that are set, that they must precede the prayer. They must be present before the prayer, and then likewise all during the prayer, and all the way till the end of the prayer. This is considered a condition. The conditions of the prayer, they are those requirements that must precede the prayer, and likewise must be present during the prayer all the way to the end of the prayer. And likewise, again, what will clarify that is to strike an example. So we have seen at-tahara, and purification is shartun min shurut as-salah. It is a condition from the conditions of the correctness of the prayer. And that means that the tahara it must be present before the beginning of the salah. Tahara must be present because it's a condition, so therefore it must be present before the beginning of salah. And likewise, it must be present during the salah entirety, all the way until the end. All the way until the end. Because الشرط هو الذي يتقدم المشروط ويستمر إلى نهايته. The condition, it comes before the thing that it is set for, and it must remain and be present until that action is finished. Until that action is finished. For example here, salah. And for example here, the condition of purification. So one must have purification before he begins the prayer. And from the time he begins the prayer all the way until the time he ends the prayer, the condition must be present. It must be present. So if an individual, for example, he were to begin the prayer with tahara, and then during the prayer he were to invalidate his tahara with a hadith, then at this time his prayer would be invalidated. Because the condition, it must be present during the entire act of worship from the beginning to the end. From the beginning to the end. And just like it is not permissible for a believer to enter into the prayer without tahara, and without fulfilling this condition, and without having that condition present, it's not permissible to enter into the prayer in this state. Likewise, if that condition is lost during the prayer, it's not permissible to continue. So this individual here who had begun with tahara and then he lost the tahara during the prayer is invalidated, and it is not permissible for him to continue. Rather, he must go make tahara again and then repeat the prayer. So therefore, the condition is something that must be present before the prayer, and it must continue from the beginning of the prayer to the end of the prayer. And this is a condition for the correctness of that action. This is a condition for the correctness of the action. So from here, we see that maybe it will be clear for some of the noble listeners and the brothers and sisters the difference between ash-shart wal-rukn. And this is a question that comes many times when we study the conditions of as-salah, because the salah has conditions, shurut, and then it has arkan, pillars, and it has wajibat, obligatory matters or actions, obligatory affairs, and it has sunan, and it has recommended actions as well. So many times someone will say, ما الفرق بين الشرط والركن? What is the difference between the condition, the condition of the prayer, and the pillar of the prayer? One thing that will help us to understand that is to go back to the definition of the shart. And that has preceded, and that is that the people of knowledge, they mentioned that هو ما لا يتم الشيء إلا به ولا يكون داخلا في حقيقته. That it is the thing that something will not be complete without it, and it is not considered from the reality of that thing. As for the rukn, the pillar, then a pillar is something that the people of knowledge, they say جانب الشيء الأقوى. The strongest part of something, the side of something that is the strongest part, and it is actually from that thing. It is a part of the reality of that thing. الركن من ماهية الشيء. It's from the reality of that thing. And the people of knowledge, they mention الركن جزء من حقيقة الشيء, that the pillar is a part of the reality of something. So the prayer, for example, will not be correct without the conditions present, but likewise it will not be correct also without the pillars present. But the difference between the two is that the condition, it is something that is outside of the prayer, and it's not a part of the reality of the prayer. For example, the tahara, it's not a part of the prayer. It's not an actual part of the movement of the prayer. And it's something that is outside of the prayer. And it's a requirement for the prayer. And it must continue from the beginning of the prayer to the end of the prayer. As for a pillar, then this is actually from the prayer itself. The prayer consists of pillars. It's from the prayer itself. For example, standing and making the takbir. and then reciting the Fatiha, and then making the ruku', and then rising from ruku'. All of these are pillars. These are actually parts of the prayer. These are actually parts of the prayer. This is what the prayer. What is the prayer? The prayer is takbir. The prayer is recitation of Fatiha. The prayer is making ruku' and raising from ruku'. The prayer is sitting, going to sujood and raising from sujood. These are the pillars of the prayer. So these pillars, they're from the reality of the prayer. And the thing about the pillars is that one will come and then sometimes it will go and it will change. And in the pillars, they fluctuate and they vary. So one will bring the first pillar, which is Takbirat al-Ihram. Takbirah al-Ihram. And then he'll move from that pillar to the pillar of reciting the Fatiha. And then he'll finish with that one. He'll move to the pillar of making ruku'. Then he'll finish that pillar and he'll move to the pillar of raising from ruku', and so on and so forth. So these pillars, they do not continue the whole time during the prayer. As for the condition, it must be present from the beginning to the end. It must be present from the beginning to the end of the prayer. So therefore, that which clarifies this answer, and the answer to what is the difference between the conditions and the pillars, the people of knowledge, they mention الشروط تتقدم الصلاة وتستمر إلى نهايتها, that the conditions, they come before the prayer. They must be present before the prayer even begins, and then they also must continue all the way until the end of the prayer. Now, they must be present from the beginning of the prayer, and then likewise continue all the way to the end of the prayer. And they're not from the actual prayer itself. وَالْأَرْكَانِ دَاخِلَةٌ فِي الصَّلَاةِ. And as for the pillars, they're actually inside of the prayer itself, a part of the prayer. They're actually a part of the prayer. فَالشُّرُوطُ مَوْجُودَةٌ قَبْلَ الصَّلَاةِ وَتَسْتَمِرُّ إِلَى نِهَايَتِهَا. So that means that the conditions, they are present before the prayer even begins, and whenever it begins, and they continue all the way until the end of the salah. وَأَمَّا الْأَرْكَانِ فَإِنَّهَا تَأْتِي أَثْنَاءَ الصَّلَاةِ مُتَفَاوِتَةً وَاحِدًا بَعْدَ وَاحِدٍ. As for the pillars, then they come during the prayer. And they fluctuate, they're different, and they come one after the other in this manner. فالأركان ليست متقدمة على الصلاة وإنما هي تكون داخلة فيها وتكون أثناءها. So we see therefore that the pillars, they are not, that the pillars, they do not come before the prayer. But rather they are inside of the prayer, and they occur during the prayer. As for the shurut, then they must be present before the prayer, and they must continue during the prayer until the end of the prayer, but they are not actually from the prayer itself. So the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, he is referring now to one of the conditions of the prayer. Babu istiqbal al-Qiblah, yani the chapter of facing the Qiblah. So therefore, facing the Qiblah is a condition from the conditions of the prayer. It must be present before the prayer starts, all the way until the end of the prayer. So the author, he says, Babu istiqbal al-Qiblah, the chapter facing the Qiblah. The Qiblah is the direction that one faces during the prayer. And what is intended by the Qiblah? Al-Kaaba al-Musharrafa, the noble Kaaba and the house of Allah Azza wa Jal in Mecca. And we see now what the author, he has intended to clarify, and that is that facing the Qiblah is a condition from the conditions of the prayer. A condition from the conditions of the authenticity and the correctness of the prayer. Shartu as-sihha. So therefore, the prayer, it will not be correct without the condition of facing the Qiblah. And this is with regards to the obligatory prayer as well as the non-obligatory prayer. From the correctness of the prayer, from the correctness of the salah, is that one will fulfill the condition of facing the Qiblah. And this is with regards to the obligatory prayer as well as the non-obligatory prayer. So therefore, if someone were to pray to a direction other than the Qiblah, other than the Kaaba, and then his prayer, if he were to face a direction other than the Qiblah, then his prayer will not be correct. And he will be commanded to repeat that prayer because he did not fulfill the condition. Whether that prayer was obligatory or whether it was not obligatory. The only time that this obligation will fall from an individual is if he's not able to. If he's in a situation because of a sickness or severe fear or the likes like this, at this time the obligation of facing the Qibla will fall from that individual. But in general, just to understand clearly that it is an obligation to face the Qibla in every single prayer, obligatory and non-obligatory. It is a condition. It is a condition in every single prayer, the obligatory and the non-obligatory. And there is an exception with regards to this, and that is in the non-obligatory prayer. And this is at the time of traveling, while one is riding on an animal or in a vehicle. So at this time, it's permissible to not face the Qibla. But listen to the conditions, we pay attention. And that is while one is traveling, and he has left his homeland, he's not a resident, he's considered a traveler, and he is performing a non-obligatory prayer. At this time, the obligation or the condition of facing the Qibla falls from him, and it's not an obligation, or it's not considered a condition for the correctness of the prayer. It's not considered a condition for the correctness of the prayer. But so long as an individual, he is a resident, and he's not traveling, and he considered a traveler, he's a resident, so long as he's considered a resident in the legislation, then it's a condition for the correctness of the prayer that he face the Qibla, whether it's an obligatory prayer or a non-obligatory prayer. Therefore, somebody could not be riding around in the neighborhood or riding around in the city that they live in and riding in their vehicle and the likes like this, and then say that they're going to pray the nafila, or they're going to pray the sunan al-rawatib, or they're going to pray the witr or the duha while they're driving around in their city that they live in, or in the town that they live in, or the place that they reside. This is not permissible. This is not permissible. The ruling of the permissibility of praying without facing the Qibla while riding on a vehicle, or while riding in a vehicle, this is for the one who is traveling. This is for the one who is traveling. And this is what the author is clarifying with this narration. And he has mentioned the narration of Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, and he clarifies this issue. And we will discuss these details inshallah in the class to come. هذا وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.